I've had a Mini-14 in my rack for years. And let me tell you something. That rifle is not what most people think it island. On the surface, it looks like a cowboy carbine walnut stock, classic lines, and that old-school vibe. But underneath, there's a whole different rifle. A rifle Ruger never really explained. Once you start pulling the layers back, the Mini takes on a completely different identity. What's up, guys? This is Ted with Line 45. Today we're breaking down the Mini-14, its oddball history, the design quirks Ruger didn't brag about, and the reasons this rifle still matters in 2025. The Mini-14 was never just a Mini M14. A lot of shooters grow up thinking the Mini is just a scaled-down M14, and yeah, you can see the family resemblance. But that's not the full story. When Jim Sullivan, the same engineer who had his hands in the AR-15 project, teamed up with Bill Ruger in the late 1960s, their mission wasn't to build a battle rifle. It was to give American civilians a carbine that looked traditional, ran smooth, and didn't look like an assault weapon sitting behind the truck seat. By 1973, the Mini-14 hit the shelves. It carried a short-stroke gas piston, clearly inspired by the M1 Garand. It had a Garand-style rotating bolt, and Ruger leaned into stamped parts and casting to keep the rifle affordable. But the early models had quirks. The pencil barrels heated up fast, and accuracy would drift once you dumped a few magazines. The bolt hold open worked, but it had to be dropped manually inside the receiver, not exactly ergonomic. Even with those rough edges, the Mini earned a reputation for being tough. Ranchers strapped them to tractors. Departments issued them for patrol duty. You'd even see them riding in the hands of tower guards at prisons, not because they were glamorous, but because they just plain worked. Over the years, Ruger quietly made upgrades, heavier barrels, better heat shields, built-in scope mounts, and eventually, ghost ring sights. They never came out and said, "We fixed the problems." They just let the rifle's reputation speak for itself. The Mini-14 is mechanically unique. Where the Mini really shines is in its mechanical setup. It runs a short-stroke, fixed-piston gas system, a scaled-down nod to the Garand and the M14. That piston is self-cleaning. And unlike the AR-15, where the gas system vents back into the receiver, the Mini keeps carbon and fouling away from the action. The op rod rides inside the stock. That changes the recoil impulse. Instead of the sharp push you feel on an AR, the Mini has a smoother, rolling recoil that feels more like an M1 carbine. The bolt locks into the receiver with a Garand-style rotation. The recoil spring assembly is tucked under the carrier, not hanging out the back. That design lets the Mini keep a traditional rifle profile. No buffer tube, no need for an extension sticking out. Ruger also leaned on investment casting for the receiver. That kept production costs in check without compromising strength. It's one of the very few carbines on the market that marries World War II-era battle rifle DNA with modern simplified production. The end result? A rifle that looks classic, feels familiar, but runs with a unique mechanical rhythm all its own. The forgotten 222 Mini-14. If you've cycled through enough Mini-14s, chances are you've never laid eyes on one chambered in 222 Remington. I didn't believe it myself until I spotted one on a rack at a gun show back in the early 2000s. Here's the deal. Ruger built a very limited run of Minis in that chambering specifically for export. Why? Because in several countries, civilian ownership of military calibers like 5.56 NATO or 223 Remington was flat-out prohibited. The 222 Mini gave shooters in those countries a carbine that was functionally the same rifle, same action, same footprint, but legally different enough to sneak past international restrictions. Now, here's the kicker. You won't find this version in Ruger catalogs. It barely shows up in their official literature. They never really advertised it. And to this day, nobody knows the production numbers. The truth is, very few of them ever trickled into private hands. Most American shooters have no clue that a 222 Mini-14 even exists. That's what makes it one of the most obscure Rugers out there. The Mini-30. By the mid-80s, surplus 7.62 by 39mm was flooding into the U.S. AKs were stacked up by the crate, ammo was dirt cheap, and everybody was looking for rifles that could run it. So in 1987, Ruger made their move. They introduced the Mini-30. On paper, it was the perfect idea. Take the familiar Mini action, chamber it in a .30 caliber Soviet round. You get a carbine that handles like a Mini-14 but hits with authority, runs soft on recoil, and drops hogs and whitetail without breaking a sweat. The problem wasn't the concept, it was Ruger's execution. Factory mags for the Mini-30 were scarce and expensive, and the bigger issue was inside the rifle itself. The firing pin geometry on early production guns was designed around softer commercial primers. When shooters ran Steelcase Wolf or Tula with hard primers, misfires and light strikes were common. Over time, Ruger made improvements. But by then, the reputation was set. The Mini-30 ended up with a label it never shook off, a rifle that was a great idea, but one Ruger never fully backed. The Mini-14 goes to war. Most people picture the Mini-14 as a ranch rifle, something riding behind the seat of a pickup. But here's the truth. This little carbine has seen service in places that would surprise you. Back in the 1980s, Ruger pushed out the GB configuration. That stood for government barrel. Those rifles came with a threaded muzzle, a bayonet lug, and a proper flash hider. Ruger didn't hype them up on the civilian market, but they sold thousands of them straight to law enforcement and corrections units. You could find minis sitting in cruiser racks with rural deputies, or riding high in the towers of state prisons. One of the longest continuous users has been the Royal Bermuda Regiment. They issued Mini-14 GBs for more than 30 years. There's also evidence of French prison forces running them. Even Peruvian police units had them in circulation. And then there's the AC-556, the select fire version of the Mini-14. This was Ruger's answer to the M16. It offered burst and full auto fire, but it never gained wide adoption. It stayed a niche rifle, mostly remembered as Ruger's attempt to break into the military market. The Mini-14's dark legacy. This is the side of the Mini-14 Ruger doesn't put in the catalogs. Because as much as this rifle is tied to ranch life and patrol work, it's also been at the center of some of the ugliest chapters in modern history. 1986. The FBI Miami shootout. The suspects were armed with a Mini-14. That rifle ran flawlessly, and despite being outnumbered, it delivered enough firepower to kill 2 federal agents and wound several more. That single fight forced every police agency in America to rethink what armed confrontation really meant. 1989. Montreal, Canada. The École Polytechnique massacre. A legally purchased Mini-14 was used in the murder of 14 women. 2011. Norway. Anders Breivik used a Mini-14 along with a Glock 17 in the Utoya Island massacre that left 77 people dead. And in 2020, Nova Scotia. A smuggled Mini-14 was one of the primary rifles used in a rampage that killed 22 people. These are not easy stories to put on the table, but they're part of the Mini's record. Because this carbine has always lived in that gray zone, a civilian rifle on the surface with serious firepower under the hood. The accuracy fix Ruger quietly pulled off. Anyone who's run the early Minis knows the truth. Accuracy wasn't their strong point. The pencil-thin barrels heated up fast, that heat shifted zero. And the gas system was so overpowered it slammed the bolt hard enough to shake the rifle during cycling. You could hold 3 to 4 MOA if you worked for it, but that was about the ceiling. Then around 2003, Ruger started making quiet changes. No big press release, no ad campaign. But if you looked closely, the barrels were heavier, the gas ports were smaller, and the machining on the receivers was noticeably tighter. By 2007, with the 580 series in full swing, the accuracy story was completely different. Groups that used to hover at 3 or 4 MOA were now closer to 2, and with the right factory ammo, consistent sub-2 MOA performance was real. Ruger never bragged about that fix. But shooters who lived through both eras know exactly when the Mini turned a corner. Why the Mini-14 still sells in 2025? Here's the question everybody asks. Why is the Mini-14 still moving off shelves when $600 ARs are stacked to the ceiling? The answer isn't ignorance. It isn't nostalgia. It's utility. The Mini doesn't look like a scary black rifle, and in states with restrictive laws, that makes all the difference. It flies under the radar. It still fits in a gun rack on a ranch truck. It still gets handed down between fathers and sons, and in some departments, it still rides shotgun in patrol vehicles. This rifle runs dirty, runs wet, runs cold, and doesn't care what brand of ammo you feed it. It doesn't demand constant tinkering or endless accessories. The Mini-14 is exactly what it's always been, a rifle. Not a platform, not a trend. A tool that just works. And for the men and women who buy them today, that simplicity is the selling point. Because in a market obsessed with rails, optics, and attachments, the Mini still speaks to shooters who value steel and walnut over M-lock and aluminum. That's the legacy, not perfection, not hype. But a rifle that's carved its own lane and stayed there for 50 years.